she's appearing on Australian MasterChef. Well, presumably she's getting a stocking great fee for that program, which I know about. But I mean, let's say that, let's be honest, that feels like it's scraping the bottom of the TV barrel, to be a judge on the Celebrity MasterChef or the Australian MasterChef. I mean, I find it distasteful in the extreme. And speaking to Australian friends of mine, as you know, they are, in the main, appalled by what's going on. I don't know what the crowds were like in Melbourne when they turned up at the hospital, but yesterday today, stroke yesterday, she wasn't seen because she was recording this TV program.
The Australian MasterChef appearance was never the kind of move anyone in Harry and Meghan's media circle would have proudly mapped out during their earlier brand-building phase. Back then, the focus was all about prestige, influence, and carefully shaped public perception. But by 2026, the reality looks very different. Taking on a role as a celebrity judge in a cooking competition reflects what's available now, not what once aligned with that original vision. In Australia, this kind of appearance signals a shift. It's less about carefully choosing opportunities and more about accepting what comes through the door. The paycheck is likely solid, no doubt about that. But the positioning doesn't match the image that was once presented to the world. There is a noticeable gap between how the brand was introduced and where it now stands. What makes it stand out even more is the contrast tied to Meghan's previous public image. Her Netflix project faced criticism, partly because her cooking skills didn't come across as convincing. Now seeing her placed in a role that suggests culinary authority creates a disconnect that's hard to ignore. On camera, during a show meant to highlight those abilities, she openly mentioned that baking isn't something she does because it's inconvenient. That moment alone raised eyebrows, and now the next step is a judging role on MasterChef Australia. The direction here is clear, and it's not subtle.
Wealth. And now, of course, they go back there, and you hear a lot about the cost of security. A lot of people kind of anxious about that, and looking at the images, it sort of could be a sort of royal tour. It's not that different from the way royal tours done by those two. I mean, if they were doing a royal tour today, let's say, this is exactly what it would look like, pretty much. Except, of course, that there's a commercial aspect, and the commerce is all to do with going into their pockets and not supporting Britain and the United Kingdom.
The progression shows a steady movement away from the original branding towards something much more commercially driven. When Rupert Bell described it as tacky, it wasn't framed as an attack, but as an observation. Not harsh, not aggressive, just a word meant to capture something that has lost its polished edge and now feels more ordinary than refined. There was a time when the Duchess of Sussex was associated with a very specific image: homemade touches, a peaceful garden lifestyle, curated simplicity, and a transition from actress to a figure tied to public service. That identity depended on a certain level of cultural positioning, something that felt elevated and intentional. A television judging role filmed alongside other unrelated appearances doesn't carry that same tone. At the same time, there were humanitarian visits taking place, including a hospital stop, that drew attention for very different reasons. The setup stood out. Children were brought together in a way that seemed structured for visuals, creating a moment designed to be captured. This approach quickly led to comparisons with how similar visits were handled in the past by established royal figures. Observers like Hugo Vickers pointed out the difference in approach. Traditionally, these visits were centered around the individuals being supported. The focus stayed on the patient, with quiet, personal interactions happening at eye level, often in private settings. The purpose came first, and any photos were secondary. This visit felt more staged in comparison. The arrangement appeared designed to create a specific image, rather than a natural interaction. That distinction sparked conversation.
A shrine to his royal days, as if he was still hankering after being part of the royal family. And when you look at the sort of similarities now, when you see the Sussexes, it's a sort of brazen attempt at hankering after their times in the royal family.
Especially among those familiar with how these engagements have historically been handled. There's also a broader concern being raised. Some critics believe that these appearances closely resemble official royal tours in their visual presentation, yet operate outside of that structure. The style, the staging, the overall feel, it all looks familiar. But the purpose behind it is seen differently, with attention shifting toward personal brand growth rather than institutional representation. This creates a complicated situation, especially in places like Australia, where the monarchy still holds formal significance. The use of titles and royal-style presentation, years after stepping away from official duties, continues to raise questions about where the line should be drawn. When it comes to whether those titles could be removed, opinions from insiders tend to follow a consistent pattern. King Charles is unlikely to take that step. The reasoning is deeply personal. His connection as a father plays a major role, making it difficult to turn what would be seen as a formal decision into something that could feel like a public conflict. There's also the awareness that any such move could lead to more public discussions, interviews, or media projects that frame the decision in a negative light. That potential fallout adds another layer to the situation, making it less about rules and more about long-term impact. Prince William, however, is often viewed differently in this context. His approach is expected to be more direct, shaped less by personal hesitation and more by institutional priorities. Once in a position to make that decision, many believe he would handle it in a way that aligns more strictly with the structure of the monarchy. Historical comparisons have also started to surface, particularly references to the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. Observers have drawn parallels between maintaining connections to a past role while operating outside of the institution.
8 years before his death, I thought that this was incredible new information to me. The condition was inoperable, and the Duke returned home to recuperate after an initial hospital stay. You write, doctors had detected a shadow on his pancreas and had cut him right across his stomach.
Accounts describing private spaces filled with reminders of royal status highlight how strong that attachment can remain even after stepping away. These comparisons don't offer conclusions, but they do provide context. They show that this kind of situation isn't entirely new, even if the modern version plays out on a much larger and more public stage. The Duke of Windsor, after stepping away from the throne, spent years building a version of royal life in exile, right there in Paris. Inside his private residence, everything still carried the weight of royal formality. Uniformed staff, structured routines, and all the symbols of a court were still in place, even though the crown itself was no longer part of his life. He had walked away from the role, but the identity tied to it never really left him. That environment became a reflection of something deeper, a man holding onto a version of himself that no longer had an official place in the world. That same pattern is now being compared to Harry's current situation. The structure may look different, but the core dynamic feels familiar. He stepped away from the institution, yet the identity shaped by it still plays a central role in how things are presented. During the Australia tour, elements of what many recognize as a traditional royal playbook were clearly visible. The hospital visits, the appearances at memorial sites, the formal ceremonies, and the presence of approved photographers all contributed to a carefully constructed image. It mirrors the past, even though the context has shifted. The key difference is how that image is being used. The Duke of Windsor kept his version of royal life largely private, something contained within his own space. In contrast, what's happening now unfolds in full public view.
Stress at that particular moment. I mean, that was really awful. It should not have happened. And of course, it was very difficult to criticize that interview immediately afterwards because of the various issues that she produced, which would have made one look, racist or going on about mental health or something. So it was tricky.
Often tied to commercial activity. That shift changes how everything is perceived. The presentation may look similar on the surface, but the purpose behind it feels different. And that distinction is what continues to spark debate. Some observers point out that the modern version carries more visible business elements. Appearances, branding, and partnerships all play a role in shaping how these moments are delivered. Whether that comes down to changing times, lifestyle demands, or differences in approach between individuals, the result stands out. What once might have been seen as a quiet, personal adjustment now appears as something much more public and structured around visibility. The Duke of Windsor's life in exile has often been described as a private, almost reflective chapter. His connection to the past remained, but it wasn't presented for widespread attention. The current situation, however, operates on a much larger stage, where every move is documented, analyzed, and discussed. That alone creates a completely different atmosphere around similar behaviors. Hugo Vickers brings another layer to this discussion through his work on Queen Elizabeth II. In his account, he shares details about Prince Philip's final years, including a serious health condition that was handled quietly for a long period of time. According to his writing, this was something managed privately without public disclosure, reflecting a preference for discretion that defined much of that generation's approach. One moment described stands out for its simplicity. On one of his final nights, Philip reportedly moved through the corridor with assistants, poured himself a drink, and sat alone for a quiet moment. The next day, after going through his usual routine, his health took a sudden turn. The way this was handled aligns with how he lived.
Go about if he has any stories about that. But they talk about how she reportedly made fun of Melania Trump,
Avoiding unnecessary attention and maintaining control over his own space. This perspective creates a sharp contrast when placed alongside the media landscape surrounding the Oprah interview. At the time it aired in March 2021, Philip was already in hospital, something that was widely known. The Queen was managing both personal and public responsibilities during that period, balancing her role with the reality of his condition. The interview introduced serious claims, including concerns about mental well-being and personal experiences within the institution. The timing of its release, however, became a major point of discussion. For some observers, it raised questions about whether the circumstances surrounding Philip's health should have influenced when and how that conversation took place. Vickers expressed strong views on that decision, suggesting that it added unnecessary pressure during a sensitive moment. At the same time, he acknowledged the complexity of responding to such claims publicly. The nature of the topics made immediate criticism difficult, as any pushback risked being interpreted in ways that could overshadow the broader context. As time has passed, more voices have entered the conversation, offering different interpretations of the statements made during that interview. For those closely connected to the institution, these reflections carry weight because they come from individuals who witnessed events firsthand. Another point that continues to surface is how widely known Philip's situation was at the time. His hospital stay had been reported, and the seriousness of it was understood. The decision to proceed with a major broadcast event during that period has been viewed by some as a choice that prioritized timing and opportunity over other considerations. There's also a broader observation about how public and private lives intersect within this family. Vickers shares details that highlight the everyday dynamics between Philip and the Queen, showing a relationship shaped by years of shared experience rather than constant formality. Simple moments, like him leaving without saying goodbye or her being informed after he had already gone, reflect a long-standing understanding between them. These details don't point to conflict, but rather to a rhythm that developed over decades. It shows how different private reality can be from the public image often presented. That contrast between what is seen and what is lived quietly behind the scenes continues to be a key part of how these stories are understood. What stands out here isn't some dramatic headline or over-the-top moment. It's something much quieter, something real. A relationship that lasted more than 70 years doesn't need constant words or formal gestures to prove its strength. Over time, understanding replaces explanation, and routine becomes its own kind of language. That's what defined Philip and Elizabeth. It wasn't performative, it wasn't staged, it just was. When you look at how their lives came to a close, it reflects that same sense of balance. They remained in familiar surroundings, close to family, in environments that matched the way they had always lived. There was no sense of chaos or outside interference shaping those final years. Philip had his quiet evening. The Queen continued her duties almost to the very end, and everything unfolded in a way that felt consistent with their lives. That stands in contrast to other historical examples, particularly the Duke and Duchess of Windsor. Their later years were marked by a very different kind of situation, one where control seemed to shift away from them. Reports of isolation, heavy oversight, and external figures influencing their final chapter paint a picture that feels far more complicated. It raises deeper questions about what happens when identity becomes tied to something that no longer exists in the same way. That connection is what keeps coming back into focus. Leaving an institution like that doesn't automatically erase the identity built within it. For the Duke of Windsor, that identity remained preserved in private. For Harry, many observers feel it's now playing out in public, visible through appearances, structured events, and carefully managed presentations. The difference in how that identity is expressed matters. One remained behind closed doors, personal and contained. The other unfolds across global platforms where every detail is seen, discussed, and analyzed. That shift alone changes the tone completely. What once might have been viewed as personal reflection now becomes something tied to visibility and ongoing engagement. The Australia tour fits directly into that discussion. Some see it as part of a larger pattern, where familiar elements of royal presentation continue to appear, but in a different context. The ceremonies, the formal tone, the visual structure, they all echo something recognizable. But without the institutional framework behind them, the meaning starts to shift. There's also a bigger question about what comes next. Some believe this is just one stage in a longer process, where future opportunities will continue to follow a similar pattern across different countries and platforms. Others think there could still be a turning point, depending on how relationships and decisions evolve over time. If there is any form of renewed connection with the institution, it would bring a completely different set of challenges. The expectations, the structure, the scrutiny, everything would change again. If not, then the current path continues, shaped by global visibility, rather than traditional roles. Moments from the past, like Philip's quiet routine or the private life of the Duke of Windsor, serve as reference points in understanding all of this. They highlight how different approaches to identity and public life can lead to very different outcomes, one focused on privacy and restraint, the other playing out in real time on a much larger stage. Even small public reactions reflect this shift. During the Australia visit, there were moments where the response from the public felt noticeably reserved. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't loud, but it was there. Sometimes the absence of reaction says more than anything else. At the same time, stories about the Queen's private personality add another layer to how this is viewed. Accounts of her sense of humor, including light impressions of well-known figures, show a side that was rarely seen publicly. These weren't meant for attention or headlines, they were moments shared in trusted settings, where she could simply be herself. Observers like Hugo Vickers have emphasized that these details shouldn't be misunderstood. They don't point to negativity or hidden tensions, but rather to a human side that existed behind the formal role. After decades of maintaining composure in every possible situation, having private moments of humor was part of maintaining balance. There's a clear difference between those private expressions and what happens when personal experiences are shared on a global stage. The Queen kept that boundary intact throughout her life. Her thoughts, observations, and reactions remained within a circle of trust, never turned into public material. That contrast continues to shape how different choices are viewed today. The decision to share personal experiences widely creates a completely different impact than keeping them within a private space. One becomes part of public discussion, open to interpretation from every angle. The other remains controlled, understood only by those closest to it. In the end, what ties all of this together is the idea of identity and how it evolves after stepping away from something so defining. Whether it's preserved quietly or expressed publicly, it doesn't simply disappear. It adapts, and how that adaptation is handled can shape perception in ways that last far beyond the moment itself. Vickers' new book, Behind Closed Doors, which focuses on the Duchess of Windsor's final years, adds a heavy layer to this whole conversation. It shows what can happen when someone loses not just a title, but the entire structure that once surrounded their life. In her final decade, the Duchess was left in a deeply fragile state, cut off from family, relying on people who were not necessarily acting in her best interest. Her world became smaller, more controlled, and far less stable than anything she had known before. Accounts describe a difficult period where her health declined, her routines became inconsistent, and she depended heavily on outside figures. There were moments where she needed medical care, was treated, and then returned to the same environment without any real long-term stability. Over time, her condition required more support, and decisions about her life were increasingly handled by others. It created a situation where control over her own circumstances slowly slipped away. What makes this story stand out is not just the personal aspect, but the absence of a protective framework. There was no strong institutional support around her anymore, no close-knit circle built on long-term loyalty. Instead, the people remaining in her orbit were often connected through convenience or opportunity. That shift changed everything. Without a stable support system, vulnerability increased, and the situation became harder to manage. This is the underlying message many observers take from her story. Leaving an institution like that doesn't just mean stepping away from status. It also means losing a built-in network of structure, accountability, and protection. Replacing that in private life isn't automatic, and in some cases, it doesn't happen at all. Looking back at the Duke and Duchess of Windsor's years in Paris, they were surrounded by people drawn to the social value that came with being close to them. That presence created an atmosphere that felt active and connected. But as time passed and as circumstances changed, that same circle began to thin out. When the Duke was no longer there and the Duchess's condition worsened, many of those connections faded away. What remained were individuals who had different motivations, and that shift in dynamic is what made her final years so complicated. It raises a question that still feels relevant now. When public attention fades and circumstances become more challenging, who stays and why? Some observers see parallels in the present, particularly when looking at the kind of social circles built around visibility and influence. Public figures often attract attention, connections, and opportunities while their platform is strong. But the long-term strength of those relationships is something that only becomes clear over time, especially during more difficult periods. The Australia tour has brought some of these questions back into focus. With mixed reactions and noticeable shifts in public response, it has made people wonder what direction things are heading in next. Whether this is a temporary phase or part of a longer pattern is still unclear. There's also ongoing discussion about what a potential return to Britain might look like. Vickers suggests that, at some point in the future, it's possible to imagine Harry appearing in a more traditional setting again. But that idea comes with a lot of uncertainty. The phrase "one day" leaves room for many different paths, some of which could take years to unfold. Those possibilities include everything from continued distance to gradual reconnection. There could be a slow rebuilding of relationships, or a continued focus on independent ventures outside the institution. Each path carries its own challenges, especially given how much has already changed. One thing that seems less likely, according to many observers, is a return that mirrors the past exactly. Moments like the 2022 Jubilee, where everything appeared unified and structured within the institution, represent a very specific context. Recreating that under current circumstances would be extremely difficult. That's because certain elements are closely tied together. The visibility, the roles, the responsibilities, they all come as part of a single system. Without that system, the presentation can look similar, but the meaning behind it shifts. It becomes something else entirely. Queen Elizabeth II understood this balance clearly. Decisions made in the past reflected an awareness that roles and responsibilities couldn't be separated without consequences. That understanding shaped how transitions were handled and why certain boundaries were maintained. The Australia tour, for many, represents the clearest example so far of what happens when that separation is fully in place. The structure is still visible, but it operates differently. The setting, the reactions, and the overall atmosphere all reflect that change. Public moments during the tour highlighted this shift in subtle ways. Reactions weren't always strong or dramatic, but they carried a certain tone. Sometimes it's those quieter responses that reveal the most about how things are being received. Looking back at Philip and the Queen again, their final chapter reflected something very different. They remained within the framework they had committed to, surrounded by the structure that had defined their lives. That consistency shaped how their story concluded. Whatever people think about that system, it provided stability and a clear sense of purpose. It also created a boundary between public life and private moments, something that was carefully maintained over decades. Without that framework, everything changes. The identity may remain, but the environment around it is no longer the same. That's where the idea of a shrine comes in. A structure that looks familiar but functions differently. In the present, that idea continues to evolve. The setting may look similar, the roles may feel recognizable, but the context has shifted completely. And as this continues to play out, the contrast between past and present becomes more and more noticeable. The historical comparison to Edward VIII adds another layer to this discussion. He was widely seen as charismatic, modern, and relatable during his time as Prince of Wales. But when the role changed and greater responsibility was required, the qualities needed for that position were different. That contrast highlights something important. Personal appeal and public role don't always align in the same way. And when expectations shift, the ability to meet those expectations becomes the defining factor. Edward wanted to choose love over duty, and that choice changed everything. The role he stepped away from required the opposite mindset, putting responsibility first no matter the personal cost. The comparison to Harry isn't exact, but the underlying pattern feels familiar. Harry was never in line to take the throne, so his exit didn't carry the same weight. Still, the situation echoes a similar tension. A man balancing personal loyalty with the expectations of an institution that shaped his entire identity. Both figures shared something important. They had a natural ability to connect with people, a kind of presence that made them relatable and effective in public roles. That quality mattered, and it worked. But at a certain point, it wasn't enough. The role demanded more than charm, more than connection. It required a level of commitment that goes beyond personal preference. And that's where the path shifted. Edward chose Wallis Simpson, someone known for her style, sharp personality, and social influence. Harry chose Meghan, who is often described as highly aware of branding and public image. In both cases, the relationship became central. shaping the direction of everything that followed. The focus moved from the institution to a more personal orbit, where decisions were made differently and priorities changed. What happened next follows a pattern that's hard to ignore. In both stories, the man steps away but continues to hold onto the identity that came with that life. For the Duke of Windsor, that identity stayed within the walls of his private residence. His home reflected a version of the world he left behind, with details arranged to preserve that connection. It was personal, contained, and largely unseen by the public. Harry's situation carries that same idea, but plays out in a completely different way. The identity is still there, still visible, but now it operates on a public and commercial level. The structure of appearances, the tone of events, the familiar imagery, it all reflects something people recognize. But instead of being kept private, it's presented to a global audience and tied to ongoing ventures. That difference matters. The Duke of Windsor's version didn't involve the wider public in the same way. It didn't depend on visibility or engagement. What we're seeing now is something much more open, where each appearance becomes part of a larger narrative. That creates a different kind of impact, especially when the setting involves sensitive environments or vulnerable individuals. This is where concerns have been raised. Some moments from recent appearances have sparked questions about how these events are structured and what role they serve. When settings like hospitals or support centers are involved, expectations are higher. People expect those moments to remain focused on care and support, not presentation. When that balance feels off, it becomes part of the wider conversation. There's also the commercial side, which adds another layer. Events, appearances, and structured engagements are now connected to a broader system that supports a lifestyle outside the institution. That creates pressure to maintain visibility, to keep things moving, and to continue building attention. Over time, that can shape how decisions are made and where appearances take place. This is what many believe Queen Elizabeth II was concerned about. It wasn't about whether someone could maintain their identity after stepping away. It was about how that identity would be used. Her focus was on protecting the institution and avoiding situations where its image could be tied to activities that might cause confusion or criticism. Looking at recent events, some feel those concerns are now playing out in real time. The structure remains recognizable, but the purpose behind it has shifted. The tone, the reactions, and the overall reception reflect that change. It's no longer just about what is being done, but how and why it's being presented. At the same time, the institution itself continues to move forward. Leadership today is managing the situation carefully, while future leadership is expected to take a more defined position when the time comes. Everything happening now is being observed, noted, and remembered. Public reactions, appearances, and decisions are all part of a larger record that continues to grow. Moments from the past provide a sharp contrast. Philip's quiet routine, the Queen continuing her responsibilities almost until the very end, those details reflect a life fully rooted within the structure they chose. They remained connected to it completely, and that consistency defined how their story concluded. That difference is what stands out most. Staying within the system creates one kind of legacy. Stepping away and building something separate creates another. Both paths come with challenges, but they lead to very different outcomes. And as this continues to unfold, the contrast becomes clearer with every new development. The identity, the expectations, the choices, they all shape how the story is being seen right now and how it will be remembered later. Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because this conversation is far from over. Make sure you hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who needs to see it. And stay locked in, because the next update might change everything again. See you on the next one.